of God's presence and guidance in all circumstance, including change. In Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8, we read that there's a time for everything and that everything on earth has its own season. This reminds us that change is a natural part of God's plan. Even though change can be unsettling, we can trust that God is always with us and has a purpose for everything that happens in our lives. In James 1, 2 through 4, we are encouraged to consider trials and hardships as opportunities for growth and maturity in our faith. Change can bring challenges, but it is through these challenges that we can draw closer to God, mistakes or circumstances, but rather by our relationship with God through Jesus Christ. Everything I've said up to this point was generated by a computer program called ChatGPT. The two images on the screen behind me were generated by another computer program called Stable Diffusion. The one on the left, I put in a prompt that said, give me a sunny mountainside overlooking a stream below. The one on the right, I said, give me a picture, a painting of a massive lightning strike over the ocean in the style of Da Vinci. These are really cool things. I find it really fascinating. And really, I thought that the little devotion on change was pretty good. I mean, I didn't make it, so I can say that. It starts with a big picture, thinking about Ecclesiastes, this sort of idea of change as a natural part of our life, and then from there, kind of zooms into James and thinks about, okay, well, how will we apply that then to our everyday lives right now? And then from there, really focuses even more on Jesus. What sort of wraps it all up by talking about the transformation into the image of Jesus. I would have changed a few things about that. I didn't really like how it talked about God having a purpose for everything in our lives. I could twist that to be a way that I would understand it, but I probably would have talked more about our fallen world and the way in which God can work through those things to make good purposes for our lives. I probably thought that it missed an opportunity to talk about the Holy Spirit in the transformation part of transforming us into the image of Jesus. It just as a warning, I think these things are really cool, but they make lots of mistakes. And so if you're interested in looking at these kinds of things, one of the warnings is that we really have to use wisdom and discernment in how we use these sorts of tools. So why did I share this with you tonight? The first is I just think they're really cool. And I wanted to share with you, how far some of these technologies have progressed. These were not around 5 years ago. Actually, both the image generation and the text generation tool that I used were not around a year ago. These are like brand new things. And I think they're going to have a massive transformational effect on our society. And I'm not the only one who thinks that. I'm really just stealing that idea from lots of people who are much smarter than I am. Because these ideas of content generation is becoming more and more ubiquitous and more available across a bunch of different fields. I think that right now, you may have seen some news articles and things about some of these tools, especially college professors and high school teachers worried about, are my students going to be able to generate essays and just turn them in? And there was I think a professor at Princeton who decided that a student would have gotten about a 70% in his class if they had just used that thing to generate all of the text for the course, which in one hand is kind of cool and also kind of scary. But I don't think Houston's in any danger for a while of us having sermons generated by computer this way. But I think that the bigger reason I wanted to talk to you about this tonight is because these, I think, are a good example of a way that we live in a continuously evolving society. If we think about the ways we communicate, the ways we learn, the ways we travel, even the ways we experience life, these are all continuously evolving. Sometimes they're accelerated by major events. We can probably all think of specific things, most recently the pandemic, the way that changed wholesale lots of aspects of our lives, the way we interact with each other, the tools that we have available to us for education, for streaming our services, and for doing all sorts of things, changes continuously. And as both individuals and congregations, we have to be willing to embrace change. And when we think about change, I'm probably one of those weird people. Most people don't like change. I love it because I'm always drawn to things that are novel and new and different and variety, and that can be both a very positive thing, but it can also be an extremely negative thing sometimes, because you can go after chasing change. And so I think that we have to think about things from both sides of that coin. What doesn't change is our mission. To love God, to be transformed into the image of His Son, and in doing so, bring light to all the dark corners of this world. The methods that we use, the ways that we communicate, all of these things, we have to be willing to change. But what we're doing, why we're here, where we're, all of that will never change. So I have two challenges for you tonight. Actually, really just one challenge with two sides. One is to ask you to think about things that you're holding on to that might be holding you back from completing this mission that God has given us. Are there things in our lives that we haven't been willing to change that we need to? Or is there a change that you need to make tonight for something that's been holding you back? And the other side of that, are there things that you think you want to change that maybe, like that computer program, we need to make sure that we're using wisdom on, to make sure that we're finding and seeking God's will and understanding what His wisdom is, and whether the consequences of those changes will be worth it for us, for our families, for our congregations, for the people in our communities. Understanding all of these things through that lens, through the idea of how will this impact us, how will it impact our community, how will it impact our ability to do our mission. So that's my challenge to you tonight. If we can help you in any way, please come forward as we stand and sing.
I am resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delight. Things that are higher, things that are nobler, these have allured my sight. I will hasten to Him, hasten so glad and free. Leaving my sin and strife. He is the true one, He is the just one, He hath the words of life. I will hasten to Him, hasten so glad and free. I will come to Thee. I am resolved to follow the Savior, faithful and true each day. Heed what He saith, do what He willeth, He is the living way. I hasten so glad and free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to Thee. I am resolved to enter the kingdom, leaving the paths of sin. Friends may oppose me,
The communion is still prepared for those that need it. It is in the room to the back, to my right, your left, if you want to go ahead and make your way there as we sing number 354. Number 354.
I gave my life for thee, my precious blood I shed, that thou mightst ransom me and quicken from the dead. I gave my life for thee. What hast thou given for me? I gave my life for thee. What hast thou given for me? My Father's house supplied, my glorious circle throne. I left for earthly night, for wandering sad and lone. I left it all for thee, as thou left aught for me. I left it all for thee, as thou left aught for me. I suffered much for thee, more than thy tongue can tell, of bitterest agony to rescue thee from hell. I bore it all for thee. What hast thou borne for me? I bore it all for thee. What hast
All right, we're on the end. This is not just the last class on the book of Deuteronomy. This is our last class in a 5-year cycle on the Torah, on the first 5 books of the Bible. And we have been working on this, I think, so in the past we used to just do trimesters. We would switch back and forth, Old Testament, New Testament on trimesters, and I think some of the education folk are working on a new structure where instead of going necessarily trimester by trimester, they were doing a cluster of the Bible together. And so we went through the Torah instead of going back to the Torah like 3 times over, I guess, 6 trimesters. And I think on the list downstairs that it was listed as 49 Sundays. And you add on that some snow days, some area-wide singings, stuff like that. I'm sure we have been working on the Torah since around January or February of last year. So it's been a long journey, and I appreciate those of you who have stuck it out. I hope that you've learned things through it. I know that I've really enjoyed getting to do Deuteronomy. And next week, and I guess I'll make sure with our education deacon, but we are starting the Gospels. Sure. And the Gospels, I think, were listed as like 47 weeks. So it's going to be about the equivalent in the Gospels, which should be good. And we're going to try to encourage some new teachers to join in, and it's going to be good. So, I really enjoyed Jared's message. We had a conversation a while back about Jim Leslie might just start adding to the monthly schedule the sermon reader from the AI of the week instead of the sermon being delivered by the preacher.
Say it ain't so.
So I know, exactly. But I've seen those conversations happen, and it's interesting. Very interesting stuff. So let's pick off where we left off last week. And last week was the Bengals playoff game where our class went 10 minutes later because we were having this really good discussion.
It wasn't worth watching.
Apparently it wasn't worth watching. But when we left off, we were talking about Deuteronomy chapter 28, which is this just key chapter in the book. Deuteronomy 28 is where they're listing off the blessings and the curses that would come upon the people if they kept and obeyed the covenant or if they didn't. And we looked at a couple of things. We looked at how that blessing and cursings structure fits sometimes even word for word with other secular ancient Near East vassal treaties of the time, which was interesting, hopefully for you if you were here last week. But what ended up happening was I went on the path to say, if we're going to understand a chapter on blessings and curses, we have to understand it in light of the whole biblical text where, God does not very often come in and give direct blessings for all good actions and direct curses for all bad actions. And I was referencing, the man born blind and the gospel stories, as well as Job and some others. And so I kind of went that, call it overly naturalistic route, that God has set up the universe in such a way that obeying his will and his laws will lead to a wise, satisfactory, blessed life. And departing from that will lead to pain and suffering. I think that is true. But at the end of last week, I had a handful of people push back and say, I don't think that's what this text is talking about. A couple of the comments were that, hey, God dealt with Israel in a very more direct manner than he seems to deal with the church and the New Covenant people, which I think was true. A couple other people just mentioned the language. The language in Deuteronomy chapter 28, we can't really get away from it when it says, the Lord will drive you and set a king over you from a nation unknown. That's verse 36. That it describes a direct agency by God in some of those curses. And it was good. I'm glad we brought it up, and I said we'd talk about it more this week if people wanted to, but I'm coming up here to say I think they were right. I think I probably overemphasized that naturalistic course. Now, I say that, and I want to reaffirm what I did to an extent, because in the question of suffering in the world and God's role in suffering, man, that's the conversation I want to have 80% of the time, okay? Too often we have people who want to have the opposite conversation where Oh, like, yeah, of course your life is in shambles. God is punishing you for being an awful person. Job's friends, right? And like, seldom, if ever, do I ever think we as modern day Christians should be viewing bad things happening in the world and ascribing divine agency to those bad things. But for the setting of Israel in this covenant law language, I think that is what was being said. You know, we still need to be careful that this wasn't a one-for-one thing. Hey, you do bad things, God's sending curses and stuff. And we even talked about last week that, you know, in chapter 28, or maybe 29, yeah, chapter 29, he says, hey, if individuals think that they'll be blessed by living in a covenant community while they themselves break the law, I will single them out and punish them. But we still have to be careful that it's not this one-for-one direct ascribing of bad things as punishments and good things as direct blessings. Because that's where we get health and wealth gospel. That's where we get the Pharisees, Job's friends. That's where we get retribution theology. We gotta balance the two, okay? I mean, Deuteronomy is good and true. It's just one piece of the mosaic of who God is in Scripture, right? We have to have this whole book informing our view of that. And like in the New Testament, we have, okay, I know, in the New Testament, we have divine agency punishing people for wicked deeds, right? Ananias and Sapphira. That was not just the way God had set things up. No, that was a direct intervention of divine punishment for their actions. So sometimes that's still there. But I still like what I said in this big picture. And for a study on Deuteronomy chapter 28, yeah, I definitely overdid it. And I appreciate that it got brought up. It's just so interesting. It is the immanence and transcendence of God. How close is he? How far is he? How involved is he? How hands-off is he? And the providence, I mean, that's just some of the biggest questions about God that we've been trying to figure out since the beginning. Okay.
I'm going to use an illustration from work to show the problem that you faced. So I had a couple of big lab reports to review as a subject matter expert for their classification level. And I'm reading through all this technical detail, and I kept picking out the, oh, well, but if we say this, someone will be able to know that about this classified program. And I got all that, and other people had already looked at this and determined things to be unclassified in different sections. And so I got to the end, and I kind of had to stop and go like, yeah, but you know too much. I knew too many of the hidden connections and the truth behind the truth.
Yeah.
And I had to read it a second time, literally, to say, yes, literally that sentence is okay, and the next one is okay, and the next one is okay. Yes, this whole document is unclassified, you can go publish it.
Yeah.
And that's the dilemma that you've got. You're looking at the Old Testament, which at the time, they looked at line by line literally, and that was the only interpretation they could have. But you have the advantage of the spirit of the law, the truth that Jesus revealed, the fulfillment, right?
Yeah.
So you know all these other connections and layers that the people at the time in Deuteronomy didn't have. And so they probably all took it very literally, because that's all they had. And we have this advantage of saying, well, no, but God's so much bigger than that, and he does all these other things. So it leaves us in a complex situation. The parallel to what I did at work is, who's my audience? If I'm sharing it with a bunch of, normal people who want to read a lab report and aren't going to be reading anything else into it, then yeah, it was all unclassified.
Yeah.
If some person hands it to a Chinese spy and says, hey, this tells you all about that program, we're in trouble.
Yeah.
Right? So there's like there's two different layers of truth. It's all the same document.
Yeah, I think that's a great allegory or illustration to kind of put to that. I mean, because that's exactly the case. It's like, this is true, and this is what it means. And yet we have seen how many thousands of years later, how this can get so badly twisted that there's defense mechanisms built in.
Yeah.
But, to return to Deuteronomy and see this culminate, I mean, how many chapters, we looked at 12 through 26 of laws, and to look at the end of that and see, no, this is saying what it's meant to say, and that's, hey, obey and experience abundance in the land that I'm giving you, or disobey and experience separation and pain. And I think God's agency was going to be a part of that. But yeah, it is. That question itself is one of the hardest ones out there. And so I always lean towards, I'm not going to look at Jimbo's life and say, oh man, of course these awful things are happening to you. God is clearly punishing you for what you've done. I will always side on, the fallen, broken world that we live in and choosing to live for God in it. But yeah, I appreciate that illustration because that is helpful. And that's what we're saying. It's a mosaic, and we have to know see the whole picture. Each little piece of the puzzle is beautiful in its own right, but we need to know the whole picture. Yeah. Because you and I were talking about this the week leading up to last week too. Kind of.
I really appreciate you struggling with this and the things you're saying. It's tough. I certainly don't have all the answers. But I would only say this, that what makes me fearful when I get really uncomfortable is when somebody speculates about a certain kind of theology that tends to repel people against God.
Right.
As opposed to being drawn near to Him. Because
Right.
to know God, the truth of God in the Bible is to love Him and to appreciate Him, to respect His wisdom, even though we don't always understand everything. But whenever people talk about God in ways, I guess I would call it maybe harsh, and when they describe to Him things that I just think, where'd you get that, that's not necessarily the God of the Bible they're talking about, and it does more harm than good. So
Right.
I'm just pointing that out. That
No, absolutely.
that's the danger of it, and you rightfully brought that out here. That's a concern about it.
Yeah, I appreciate that because as we try to learn and as we try to understand God, a large part of what we're doing is missiological. It's about knowing God for the sake of the nations, as we've seen in Exodus and Deuteronomy and every part of the Torah so far. He reveals Himself to Abraham, to Israel, to Joseph, to Moses, to Pharaoh, so that everyone would come to know Him. We see that over and over and over again in here. And so when we're doing this, we have that in mind, and then we approach a very difficult text like Deuteronomy 8:28, and I hope that I don't come with it defensive and trying to explain God away from these actions, because that is crossing a line. It can be. But we, at the same time, need that conscientious level to say, okay, let's show people the whole picture, because people like to find, if it's a mosaic, if it's a puzzle, they like to find this piece and say, man, isn't your God awful? And it's not true. And understanding the community of Israel as the bearers of salvation makes this a whole lot more okay, doesn't it? Or at least for me, if I understand God directly cursing a people for disobeying Him, that can sound harsh if someone's just telling you that off the streets. But if I explain it to you, it says, well, yeah, because he's trying to get Israel to a point where He can bring in a Messiah so the whole world can live in eternal glory with their Father in heaven, then a harsher hand to Israel makes a whole lot more sense, doesn't it? Yeah, good stuff. So this is last week's class, but do we have anything else on it? I'm going to do one more thing from last week's class that I didn't want to miss. Okay. So the other thing from last week is chapter 30. Can I get somebody to read chapter 30, verse 15 through 20? Yeah, 15 through 20. It's like the last 2-3 paragraphs of chapter 30.
I got you.
Go ahead, Dave.
See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in His ways and keep His commands, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you are not obedient, and if you are drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. This day I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God. Listen to his voice, and hold fast to him. For the Lord is your life, and he will give you many years of the land he swore to give to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Thank you. I love it. I mean, we've talked about Deuteronomy kind of being a sermon too. I'm not making these things up. It's just interesting that the Hebrews and Deuteronomy coincides. And it sounds like that, right? He says, here I set before you today life. I love it. Here I set before you today life and prosperity, but also I set before you what? Death and destruction. That's right. Here I set before you life, and I set before you death. I set before you curses, and I set before you blessings. And then down at the end, so choose a life, so that you and your children may live, and love God, and that you may love the Lord your God. Listen to his voice, hold fast, and he will give you many years in the land that he has promised you. It's just, he's standing there, Moses, knowing that he's not going to go over there with them. And he set all this out. This is where we've been. This is what God is doing. This is how you need to live. Here's the laws for being God's people. Here's what will happen if you choose. Here's what will happen if you don't choose to follow him. So here today, it's right in front of you. Life and death, cursings and blessings. So choose life. It's a great invitation, then get the song leader up there and see who comes up front, right? Who chooses life. It is, and it's important for us. It seems like the climax of the book to me, and it comes down to the choice to be had, that people have to decide for themselves. Will they obey? Will they reject? Will they follow? Will they not? Will they take life, or will they go a path of death?
It's just interesting that the world, when they lightly look at things like Leviticus and Deuteronomy, they see a list of laws.
Yeah.
No free will there, just, do this or God's going to smite you. And yet, there's a high note. It's like, hey, free will didn't go anywhere. You still get the choice.
You choose. Yeah, exactly. I mean, these aren't robots. This is their choice. And the next chapter 31 says, God talks to Moses and Joshua, says, they ain't choosing life. They're not going to choose life. But before that, I think it's interesting, nobody chooses death, right? Nobody's standing there with a split in the road and bright sunshine on this side and lightning and terror on that side. It says, I'm going to go this way, right? We don't often, on a surface level, choose death, do we? We choose things that look like life, but turn out to be false promises of life and ultimately do lead to death. I mean, that's what the idols, the idolatry that Israel is going to face is, and that's like Deuteronomy's number one focus is you're going into a new land with new people and new things. Don't chase after their gods. Because it's going to look like life. If there's a bit of a famine in the land, and hey, they say if you pray to this God, it will bring you rain, and they've had rain, that looks like a path to life, doesn't it? On a surface level. And yet, choosing to pursue those kind of things ultimately is a path to death. And so it's important for us to remember that there is one path to life. A way, the truth, and the life, right? It's John 14. Jesus kind of says the same thing. Choose me, because I am the only path to life, to the Father, to truth. And it's the same message from Deuteronomy 30 all the way to John 14 and Revelation 22. It's all there together. And it's important for us to remember.
Yeah, I think one of the really important undercurrents here is intentionality. You asked this question of who would choose life versus death. I think a lot of people just want to avoid choosing.
Yeah.
And I'm in that boat as much as everybody.
Yeah.
It's sometimes so much easier just to go with the flow. Where's everyone else going? And I've got so many choices to make. How can I cut down on the choices?
Yeah.
Just do what's in front of me. And I think part of the call for the people here is to be intentional.
Right.
And to realize that there is a real choice here, and not just once, but daily throughout their lives.
That's great. Yeah. Great way of putting that.
So Donna was just remembering the Super Bowl ad from a couple years ago from Geico, where there's this group of young people and it's a scary situation, and it's like, well, let's get in the car and leave. No, let's go in the scary garage with all the chainsaws.
Yes, yeah.
Right?
I know what you're talking about.
And it's the classic thing that happens in the horror movies, And that they always make some poor choice and they ended up getting slashed or killed or dragged down or whatever. Bad things happen when you make bad choices.
Right.
You know, from a cultural perspective, we see these bad choices and we laugh at them. We think they're silly. Sometimes we're entertained by them. We go to the horror movie just to see all these bad choices people are going to get themselves into. Very much human nature. We recognize it intellectually. We can see this and laugh at it. Yet the world's full of people who don't get it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we can intellectually choose, and the world is a weird place. And, you know, Satan's not just leaving a signpost to hell. He's painting them over with other attractions along the way, right? You know, it's never as blatant and scary on the outside as that commercial is. It's usually much more confusing. But still, even when it's not, don't we just have a hard time choosing what's right? Even when we know how dumb a decision is, and we're driven by one thing or another, and we continue to choose evil, yeah. But I like the idea of intentionality too. I mean, like, we can't just coast. If we want life, we have to choose it. We have to pursue it. We have to, you know, and that's back all the way to Deuteronomy, is it 6? I think it's 6. You put it on your forehead. Put it on your gates. Talk about it when you wake up. Talk about it when you lay down. He's constantly reinforcing to them the need to integrate it into their very heart, soul, and strength. Not mind. Mind comes in the New Testament's version of that.
I'd just like to further, again, highlight how that we hear the heart of God in this too. He's like a father pleading with his children. He doesn't want them to die.
Yeah.
And you can just hear his heart saying, choose life. You know, it just comes out so strong. God wants the very best for us, and we need to understand that about God.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way. That's a great thought. That, you know, he never wants us to choose death. He wants us to choose life, and so he gives it to us. But he doesn't force us down the road.
Right.
It's not shotgun wedding God. Here, you're going to choose life whether you like it or not. No, it's
Choose life or I'll kill you.
exactly, yeah. Which was my problem with Deuteronomy 28. Anyway, you know, Stan preached on Deuteronomy 28. Y'all remember that? This was, so when we were doing, we preached through the Bible in a year. So it was 2020, and Delaney had just had Hattie. So I was out 2 weeks, and Stan came in when we were in Deuteronomy and preached Deuteronomy 28. I think it was 28. It was Deuteronomy.
Was it class though?
No, I think it was a sermon. It's on YouTube somewhere. See how Stan deals with it, and then we'll see.
I can't remember it. I'm glad you did.
Well, we're talking about just like a month. It'll be 3 years in a month. But I remember watching it. It was good. I thought it was really good. Because I didn't have to preach on Deuteronomy that week, because I just decided to have babies instead. It's me out a lot of sermons.
Way easier.
Yeah. All right, let's get to this week's classes for the last 25 minutes. Deuteronomy 31. So we have 4 chapters left, 31, 32, 33, and 34. 34 is all about the end of Moses. But I want to do a few things out of 31, because I think 31 is really intriguing. And then 32 is, I'm going to try to break down for us as well. But 31, can somebody read verses 1 through 6?
I'll take it.
And these are actually just the very next verses from what Dave just read for us.
Then Moses went and spoke these words to all Israel. And he said to them, I am 120 years old today. I can no longer go out and come in. Also the Lord has said to me, you shall not cross over this Jordan. The Lord your God himself crosses over before you. He will destroy these nations from before you, and you shall dispossess them. Joshua himself crosses over before you, just as the Lord has said. And the Lord will do to them as he did to Sihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites, and their land, when he destroyed them. The Lord will give them over to you, that you may do to them according to every commandment which I have commanded you. Be strong and of good courage. Do not fear nor be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, he is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you.
Thank you, Gary. You know, transitional leadership is a very important thing, right? And I gotta say, the Bible emphasizes that. The Bible, when there is a transition of a major leader in the gospel stories, the Bible takes the time to really highlight that. Moses to Joshua, Think of Elijah to Elisha, David to Solomon, even Samuel to Saul. And who else? I was thinking, Jesus and the disciples to an extent, right? I mean, like, the Bible does emphasize and take time to show this. And every time there just seems to be this air of anxiety around what will be when Moses isn't there anymore to guide us, when Samuel's not there anymore to guide us, when Jesus ascends back into heaven. And like, that is the natural human response. It's not necessarily a bad thing. But at least here, and I think in most of these texts that I'm personally thinking of, there is always an emphasis to remind the people who are nervous of what the future might hold that their true leader is not actually leaving them, right? Right there in the text it said, God himself will cross over ahead of you. Yeah, you see Moses, you've been listening to Moses, you've been following Moses, but who have they really been listening to and following this whole time? It's God, right? And God's not leaving them. He will still be the one leading the charge. And I think that's so important for us to remember. We always look for these figureheads, these more tangible things that we can grasp onto and understand a little easier. But when we really are trusting in the eternal sovereign one, then there's never any change of leadership really going on. That's something I think we in a world with a lot of change, we can take great comfort in that. And I think that was exactly what Israel was supposed to see. They were about to be crossing over over the rivers to the land that their parents were so afraid of, they ran away. And now they're going to do it without Moses. Their parents were afraid with Moses. But God is the one who is going to lead the charge in front of them. Of course, God always meets us in our needs. And so he does choose to partner with and elect a leader out of the group over and over and over again. And so he does. He does it again with Joshua. What does he tell Joshua? Hey, you don't be anxious either. Because you're anxious if you're the community, or you're anxious if you're the leader of the community. And God reminds Joshua that he's with him as much as he's with Israel. So neither the new leader nor the new community need stress.
All right, so you picked all the good leaders, but then there's all those bad leaders, and people willingly follow them too, and get led farther away from God than actually following God.
Yeah.
Right? So we're not relieved of the responsibility as individuals, back then or now,
Right.
to see God in that leader, or see that God is not in that leader.
Yeah. Yeah, we got to be diligent about it, for sure. Who's the guy in Numbers who leads that big rebellion? It starts with a K. Korah, thank you. Korah's rebellion, right? He got a pretty big following. The idea that they might want to have someone come up and challenge Joshua now must have been on somebody's mind. Even Miriam and Aaron at one point tried to challenge Moses and get higher up on the totem pole. But they have this big succession ceremony where Moses puts his hands on him and they share that he gives over his wisdom, I think is the word, to him. Anyway, yeah, absolutely. Let's keep going. The next passage, 9 through 13. Can I get somebody to read 9 through 13? Pete?
So Moses wrote down this law and gave it to the Levitical priests, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. Then Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, in the year of canceling debts, during the festival of tabernacles, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, you shall read this law before them in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, and children, and the foreigners residing in your towns, so that they can listen and learn to fear the Lord your God and follow carefully all the words of this law. Their children who do not know this law must hear it and learn to fear the Lord your God as long as you live in the land you are crossing the Jordan to possess.
Thank you. This might actually be my favorite part of chapter 31. So it says Moses wrote down this law. What is that? It's Deuteronomy, right? I mean, that's kind of cool. Moses writes down pretty much the book of Deuteronomy, and he takes it, and he makes God leads them to make care that it would be stored, that it would be kept, and that it would be continually brought before the people, right? Israel is already known for their rebellious, short-minded tendencies. And so God sets up a way for them to continually be brought before the law and kept informed and kept convicted and kept learned. And it's every 7 years, which is really neat because, well, I mean, it said it in here, but like, what happens every 7 years? Yeah, the canceling of debts. And because of Deuteronomy, the freeing of slaves. That was a law we didn't get to with the snow day, but like all the other Exodus and Leviticus, the 7th year is for forgiving debts. In Deuteronomy, he adds freeing slaves to the 7th year. So yeah, it's this time of celebration, of recognizing the grace of God and the freedom that is found in God. Also, specifically in the 7th year, they're supposed to read it during the Week of Tabernacles, right? When they're celebrating the remembrance of God leading them up out of Egypt. And so it's this moment where they are just fully surrounded by the remembrance and the present experience, the past remembrance of his salvation, the present experience of his grace and goodness. And in the middle of all of that, what do? They read Deuteronomy. I mean, if we tried to put together like a really high celebratory day to remember all the good things from God, and it was like, in the middle of this day, or in the middle of this big celebration, you know what we should do? Sit everybody down and read Deuteronomy. Like, I think there's going to be some people who wouldn't love that idea, right? But what it does is it houses their experience of the law, because they don't have their Deuteronomy scroll at home, okay? And it houses their experience of the law of God in the middle of present and past celebration of his grace and goodness and salvation. That's how we should remember God's commandments. The laws that seem like do this, do this, do this, do this, choose life, don't choose curses and death, is in the middle of celebrating all the goodness. I mean, that's where this belongs. It's that mindset that really lets, I think, the heart of Deuteronomy thrive. And I love that. Do you have your hand?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it true that in some contexts, it just uses that word law and it's just talking about Deuteronomy? And it's not to neglect or negate
The other law,
Leviticus and all that, but just Deuteronomy is kind of a sum up of the law, and they would use that term sometimes to apply that book. And a lot of scholars think that over in 2 Kings 22 with Josiah, when they're repairing the temple, and they say, oh, we found the law, they think that's what they found was Deuteronomy.
Yeah, exactly.
And he read the covenant of blessings and curses, and that's why he ripped his clothes apart.
Yeah.
He tore his clothes and said, we're in trouble.
Because it was happening to them, for real.
It was happening,
A couple weeks ago we talked about the horrid, shuddering sight of the woman who would eat her newborn infant in the afterbirth and begrudge it from her husband and children. That happens in 2 Kings. What is it, 16, 18? They said, we decided to eat her child first, and the next day came and she hid her child so we could eat her. That actually happened because they were doing exactly what Deuteronomy told them not to. Not to detract from your point, which was excellent. Yeah, I mean, there are interpretations of this that the law written down here was the whole Torah. The word Torah in Hebrew means law. So that's a possibility. But it does seem like this being set outside the Ark of the Covenant was probably either just chapters 12 through 26, but I think probably more the book of Deuteronomy with the blessings and curses, with the historical review of salvation in chapters 1 through 3, with the Shema, in chapter 6, and all of that. And I think you're right. I think when Josiah, they had been living this horrid lifestyle, doing everything they were told not to do in Deuteronomy, and then in 2 Kings, they're surveying some stuff, and these guys come back, hey, we found this book of the covenant, we found this law, and they read it aloud, and he tears his clothes, and they start this whole reform. And I think that reform was rooted off the laws they found. I think you're exactly right, in Deuteronomy specifically. It might have been the full 5 books, but I think it was Deuteronomy. I think that's kind of a common consensus.
Yeah, I mean, that opportunity to reset the nation, Ezra and Nehemiah.
Yeah, Ezra, I mean, they stand up. He reads it all day to them while they're standing there, and they love it. They're crying, and they're,
It's a motivational speech.
It is. And I mean, like, so how weird is it that when we think of Deuteronomy, we're not thinking about tearing our clothes in passion. We're not thinking about standing for hours listening and weeping. We're not thinking of being in the middle of a celebration of grace. To us, it's the boring part that we got to sit through once every 5 years, whatever. But it is. I mean, like, it's good stuff when we savor it and read the heart of God behind it. Man, it's good. Chapters 4 and 6, chapters 10, chapters 30. I think it's great. Okay. 10 minutes. So in the second half of chapter 31, God calls Joshua and Moses. He says, look, they're not going to do it. They're going to get over there, and they're going to fail. They're not going to choose life. They're going to go after idols. They're going to disobey. So here's what I want you to do, Moses. I want you to write a song. I want you to write a song that they can sing to remind them what they should be doing wherever they go. Man, songs are catchy, right? I mean, like, we know, now we can look at it psychologically to see how it works in the brain in incredible ways. But God was using it back then. He says, you're going to write a song to help them remember. I've never seen Deuteronomy 32 set to music, but I'm not sure how you would. But let me just real quickly break this down, because it's interesting. Chapter 32, I think, and some of the studies I did, it wasn't, not everybody agrees, but it really kind of presents a court case of God versus Israel. God as the prosecutor, Israel as like kind of the criminal defendant, whatever. And it's I think every single prophet uses that same style of conviction and judgment in their writings that you see Moses kind of invent here in chapter 32. So in verses 4 and 5, and this 32 is that whole song of Moses. 4 and 5, you kind of get the picture of the two parties here. It says, he is the rock. This is the first time that's used, by the way. God is the rock. This is the first time. He is the rock. His words are perfect. All of his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong. Upright and just is he. Which is beautiful. He's like, this is the steadfast, perfect, wonderful God. He is the rock. There's nothing wrong in him. But on the other hand, verse 5, they are corrupt and not his children. To their shame, they are warped in crooked generations. So you have a rock on one hand, and you have something that's warped and crooked on the other hand. So that's 4 and 5. That kind of sets up who we're talking about here. But then in verses 7 through 14, it's kind of the prosecutor's speech, giving a historic review of all the ways that God has loved Israel, all the ways God has cared for Israel, and how that should demand their exclusive worship. Hey, 7 through 14, these are the wonderful things I did for them. This is how I saved them. They should worship me as their God because of all of this. But in 15 through 18, it describes all of Israel's rebellion and sin. It's kind of an indictment against them. Hey, God loved them with all this, but they, on the other hand, have chosen not to do any of it. Verse 15, they grew fat and kicked, filled with food. They became heavy in sleep. They abandoned the God who made them and rejected the rock, their salvation. So then in verses 19 through 25, it describes God's sentencing, okay? As the rejected father is the image they use. As the rejected father, he too rejects his offspring, Israel. And I love, there's this interesting little part in verse 26, I think. Nope. See if I can find that. 21. They made me jealous by what is no God, and they angered me with their worthless idols. I will make them envious by those who are no people. Isn't that kind of neat? He's saying they used things that were not a God to make me jealous, idols. So I'm going to take someone who's not a people and make them jealous. Does that sound familiar at all?
Romans.
Yeah, Paul picks that up in Romans 10 and 11. Yeah, he comes back and says, Israel rejected God, so he rejected them. And then God chose the Gentiles and brought them in to make Israel jealous and hopefully return back to the covenant. Yeah, Paul picks up on that in Romans 10 and 11. Isn't that neat? I mean, it's kind of embedded right there in Deuteronomy 32. Yeah. And in Acts 2, okay, yeah. And, just how wonderful is it that even in his punishment, God is seeking ways to save his people and others, right? That even in a judgment, sentencing, and punishment, He's working it out to save people and redeem the original people who have fallen away.
Just like in a daytime soap opera, making someone jealous to win them back never works.
Yes. I'm not prepared for Romans 9 through 11 class. Is anybody prepared for Romans 9 through 11 class? Our owls are doing that on Wednesday morning. They're doing Romans. I'll be curious to see. That's a hard one. And then verses 26 through 34. So the sentencing was, hey, they rejected me, and I'm rejecting them. That's 19 through 25. But verses 26 through 34 is kind of this divine deliberation where God is counting the cost of punishing his people. You know, he kind of comes back and he says, you know what? It's going to hurt my name and my legacy if I punish them. Verse 26 and 27, I said I would scatter them and erase their name from human memory, but I dreaded the taunt of the enemy, lest the adversary misunderstand and say, our hand has triumphed and the Lord has not done all this. So God's saying, I'm going to punish them because they were wrong, but I dread the idea that somebody who does the punishing for me, whether I use, Babylon or Assyria, them thinking, oh, God abandoned them, look how great we are, our gods are better. God is just bothered by the thought that they would think that. So then in verses 35 through 42, there's kind of this reverse decision where he chooses to vindicate and save even his rebellious people. Verse 36 there is really good. The Lord will vindicate his people and relent concerning his servants when he sees their strength is gone and no one is left, slave or free. So you kind of see, do you see that courtroom theme here? It says, here's what I did for Israel. Here's how they rejected and rebelled me. So here's how my sentence, I'm going to abandon them like they abandoned me. But people are going to think poorly of Yahweh God because of that. So I will actually ultimately end up vindicating them.
But we've already seen this conversation between Moses and God.
Yeah.
Where Moses reminds us, hey, the Egyptians are going to think you're not a God
Right. If you let them all die, if you kill them all.
Wilderness. So, this duality of the circumstance, Moses and God have dealt with this before. He's just reiterating it again.
Exactly. In a song. Yeah. And like that, don't forget the context here. This is a song that they can sing without a written Torah in front of them. In between the 7 years, I guess, of the readings, in between the festivals that remind them of all the good that God has done, here's a song for them to sing. But in that song, one, it teaches them who God is, what God has done, how he wants to save them, what he will do if they disobey. It teaches them. But it simultaneously convicts them. It's convicting while it's educating, and it's educating while it's convicting. And, later in the history of Israel, when things go sideways and they fail, this song is there to remind them that the failure and the suffering they had was theirs, not God's. God didn't fail here. They failed. And they had this song just on the tip of their tongues as they went along their way to remind them that, hey, any suffering that's had here is because we left God, not because he left us. And there is a chance for us to seek him back out, to come back to God, which is, the people of exile. That's exactly what they did. Any thoughts or comments on chapter 32? I know I rushed through that. Okay. I'm going to skip 33. It says, interesting, Moses offers blessings to the 12 tribes. It's almost a direct parallel to Genesis 49, where Jacob, right before his death, offers blessings for his 12 sons. Very, very similar. And some people might even think that it's a bookend to the Torah, right? This happened in Genesis, and now it's happening in Deuteronomy. It also kind of elevates the image of Moses up alongside the patriarchs. He's kind of fulfilling the role of Jacob here. But let's just read the last chapter, 12 verses. Anybody want to read that? I'll read it real quick. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah across from Jericho. There the Lord showed him the whole land from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms as far as Zoar. Then the Lord said to him, this is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him. Who's he? I think God, it doesn't say. He buried him in Moab in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day, no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. Actually, it says his vigor was not gone. Anyway, the Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him, and he did what the Lord had commanded Moses. I like this ending here. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. So a handful of things there. It's interesting. And it's kind of hard to accept for us, so invested in on this story along the way, that Moses doesn't get in. That's what he was starting out to do. He was chosen by God there at the burning bush to take his people into the promised land, and he doesn't get there. And there's some thoughts on that. I mean, it could be that, like, hey, we have this really godly guy in Moses who's kind of unparalleled in the Old Testament. Maybe there needed to be a little bit of a check on him, to say, he wasn't, to balance out all the good things he did. I think the lost grave keeps him from being venerated, right? And then focusing too much on him. And it's interesting that now without Moses immediately mediating the words and laws of God, because Joshua is not doing this the same way that Moses did. In fact, the roles kind of get split. Moses was like the leader and the go-between for God, so the king and the priest. But after this, you get Joshua, who's kind of like the leader guy, and you have the high priest, who is more of like the God person. But he has to use the Urim and Thummim to get information from God. He doesn't just talk to God face to face like Moses did. Later, there will be someone who kind of combines the king and priest role in the New Testament. But yeah, there's no one like him again. In fact, verses 10 and 12 give language to Moses that had really only been used of God to this point. The fact that there was no one like him is said a couple times about the Lord their God in Deuteronomy. And then the line in verse 12, no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds. That's said about God specifically twice earlier in Deuteronomy. And someone that I read, they said, I like this, they said, it's almost like God is saying, Moses said there is none like Yahweh, but I say there is none like Moses. If this is the inspired word of God, it's like he's saying there's none like Moses, kind of as a nod back to Moses. I thought that was nice. But I like to think that even as Moses stood on that mountaintop looking over into the promised land that he would not inherit, there was a twinkle in God's eyes knowing that Moses would return to a mountaintop, and a mountaintop in the land, as he conferenced with Elijah and God's very son on God's next plan of salvation. In fact, the word Luke uses there is they were talking about Jesus' exodus. It's literally the word, exodus, that he was going to perform on the cross. Right? He didn't get into land here, but we see him back in the land. Also, last little point, it's interesting that the Torah doesn't include the land. That at the end of the Torah, they're not in the land. This has been the goal since Abraham, and yet they're not in the land. All the promising, all the journeying, and they're still not in the land. But I think that's kind of appropriate, right? Because the Torah points us to the land. It points us to the blessing. It teaches us how to receive and how to live for God, but it doesn't guarantee it, does it? It doesn't guarantee the land. It doesn't guarantee the security. It doesn't guarantee the blessings. It just teaches us how to obey. The choice of whether they do or don't is left up to the rest of the story. It's kind of for us too. We receive the will and the heart of God, but it's up to us to decide if we are going to enter the land with him or not. Let's go ahead and bow. Father God, we are so grateful for your word, Lord. We're grateful for the Old Testament. We ask that you would continue to give us a heart and a mind to understand who you are through your texts from beginning to end, that we would have this community of faith, that we would help each other learn and seek to know you better, and that we could live full and abundant lives because of that. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right.
Thank you, brother.
Now class is over. If you want to comment on those last little bits, you can. You know, just with my 4-year-old.